What's up, YouTube? Today we're going to be talking about the ArpegEar Hane and why it might be one of the best single dynamic driver IEMs under $300. The ArpegEar Hane was created by Topping, a name that should need no introduction if you've been paying attention to the DAC and amplifier market over the last several years. I've owned and evaluated several Topping DACs over the years, and I've liked all of them, so I was very intrigued to hear that they'd created an IEM. The ArpegEar Hane comes in at $129, and my review unit was sent out by Shenzhen Audio. As always, I'm not being paid to make this review, and my thoughts and opinions are my own. First, let's talk about what comes in the box. You get 3 pairs of silicone ear tips in small, medium, and large sizes. You also get 2 pairs of foam ear tips, as well as what appears to be a pair of Moondrop spring tips. The included cable uses fabric sheathing and a robust metal hardware and is terminated in a 3.5mm audio jack. There's also a small cloth carry bag in the box, but I don't like the texture or feel of this bag at all. It feels very cheap. Finally, there's a small tool to adjust the Hane's tuning switches. The all-resin housings are very compact and super comfortable. This is actually one of the most comfortable IEMs that I've used in quite a while. It's also very secure and very isolating for a vented dynamic driver design. Finally, let's take a look at the 4 tuning switches, which we'll talk about in a second. Let's pull up the graph and talk about the sound signature. I'll also leave a link to these measurements in the video description. I realize that this is pretty overwhelming, which is the product of having 4 different tuning switches that all affect the frequency response differently. Tuning switches 1 and 2 affect the bass response below 300 Hz. Tuning switch 1 gives you a 2 decibel bass boost, and tuning switch 2 gives you a 4 decibel bass boost. Flipping both of these switches up gives you a cumulative 6 decibel bass boost. I found that having just switch 2, or the 4 decibel bass boost, was plenty for me. Let's move on to the next 2 switches. Switch number 3 cuts the presence and treble regions a lot compared to the default tuning, while switch number 4 boosts these regions. Having both switches up cuts the treble and presence regions, but not as much as just having switch number 3 flipped up. I liked the most conservative tuning, so just switch 3's flipped up. Putting this all together, I did my critical evaluations with switches 2 and 3 switched up, so the 4 decibel bass boost and the presence region and treble region cuts. I do want to take a moment to praise Topping for having these switches be genuinely useful. I've tried a lot of different IEMs over the years that have very slight differences between tuning switches or tuning nozzles, and that definitely isn't the case here. Getting back to the graph, I think what you have here is very similar to a lot of other contemporary Harman-ish target curves. It's not quite as tucked into the sub-bass as a lot of other Harman-ish targets, but I actually think that this works in the Hane's favor, because it compensates for the somewhat recessed lower mid-range. The mid-bass region is still restrained enough to avoid muddying up mid-range clarity. The mid-range is a plateau-style elevation centered at around 3 kHz, which suits my head-related transfer function just fine. The lower mid-range is still pretty recessed, and there's more presence than I would like, but overall, this is pretty enjoyable for me. I actually think that the most special part of this IEM is the treble, although this isn't necessarily apparent from my measurements. My measurements were done with an 8 kHz resonance peak to match most of my other measurements. However, the ArpegEar Hane has a pretty deep insertion depth, which moves the actual resonance peak further out past 8 kHz. I'd recommend taking a look at Unheard Labs measurements of the ArpegEar Hane, which have the resonance peak closer to 10 kHz, which I think is more accurate. I'll leave a link to those down in the video description as well. All of this is to say that the ArpegEar Hane has probably what is the best treble response of any IEM with a single dynamic driver configuration that I've heard under about $300. I don't hear the post 10 kHz suckout that plagues so many other IEMs, which I think is a tremendous achievement with this driver configuration. Let's talk about the technical performance now. The bass is detailed, cleanly articulated, and tactile, but I think that sub-bass extension could be better. I also think that bass texture, while okay, is not great. Like I talked about a minute ago, the lower mid-range is pretty recessed, so there's not as much body to lower mid-range instrumentation as I would like. On the other hand, vocal intelligibility is really good for both male and female vocals. I don't necessarily think that the female vocals are sibilant, but there is a bit of a zealous edge to female vocals, which is probably a result of having just too much presence for my tastes. I don't hear percussion compression per se, but I do think that analog percussion sounds a little bit flat. As you can probably imagine from my description of the treble region just now, detail retrieval is truly excellent for the price, with very natural sounding transient delivery and very good instrument separation. The soundstage is also pretty decently sized, especially for a single dynamic driver. It's not quite out of head, but it's pretty close. To wrap this up, unlike SMSL's first attempt at a dongle DAC, which I found very underwhelming, Topping's first attempt at an IEM is a resounding success. I think they've brought something special to the treble with this IEM, and the tuning switches give you a lot of adaptability for different listening preferences. The inherent technical performance is very solid as well. If you've made it this far, please consider dropping a like and subscribing to the channel. I've got a bunch of other IEM reviews coming up soon, and you don't want to miss out. Until next time, this is Bedrock Reviews, signing off.